depending on when you heard this or if you did, we just discussed an FDA push to ban vaping products, essentially, and then also a secondary or a parallel push to reduce the amount of nicotine in cigarettes. And we discussed the reasons why these are harmful tactics. On one hand, it's you mentioned this is avoiding our responsibility. I mean, we're worried about people dying, and we're worried, I think, and we're worried about people being unhealthy, and we're certainly worried about our place among the world where people are most in despair and suffering from, mental illness or things that follow. And so we try to narrowly focus in on something like addiction to drugs, specific drugs that are pulling us in. We play every decade. There's a new, or maybe more often than that now, maybe every few years, there's a new drug that is ostensibly causing all of this distress for us. And if only we can, stomp it out to the point that no one thinks about it or talks about it or wants to use it anymore, then we'll be fine. But of course, rearing its head the next 5 or 10 years is some other drug. And for whatever reason, we have not thought about the fact that maybe the drugs pop up because they're filling a void that we need to deal with, and we don't deal with that. So we discussed this in terms of, people who are drug-centered, drug-focused, and want to solve the problem that way. I'm interested in another way of thinking about this issue, people who maybe we're more compatible with, and that's harm reductionists. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but people who practice harm reduction or harm reduction philosophy. The reason why I'm thinking about this is that somebody sent me an email recently. She said, "Dear Zach, how are you? Can I ask you a question about harm reduction?" Okay. In short, let me pull the 6-bit in this. In short, do you think that addicts, she said, please let me use the term, so people who are addicted on the streets of San Francisco, etc., have any responsibility to the public that is, quote, supporting them? I'm not talking about the folks with schizophrenia or severe mental illness. I'm talking about drug users. I realize there's significant overlap. I'm not a harm reduction opponent, but I think this form of radical harm reduction is wrong. It's clinically wrong. It engenders more helplessness, or at least discourages them from becoming productive in any way. I could care less if people use drugs. I only care that they use them in a way that impairs their participation in society as workers or parents, etc.
So that's a pretty fair question by a reasonable human being.
Yes.
And it's one that's a lot on people's minds. I know San Francisco kind of throughout. I lived in Oakland for a while. I know San Francisco throughout my life. And San Francisco is an unpleasant place to be for them in large part now, because there's a large drug addicted population. And recently, San Francisco is the most politically progressive place in the United States. They voted out an uber progressive district attorney around issues of crime.
Mm-hmm.
So there's now a backlash among people. Is harm reduction mean let people do whatever they want to do? So I want to add 2 points here. I want to give my little example of that. I live in Brooklyn, which is a little bit the East Coast version of San Francisco. And somehow during the COVID crisis, I was in an outdoor cafe and a woman was getting COVID tested because she's an emergency room nurse in Manhattan and I'm in Brooklyn. And she was a local ethnic person. She grew up in an ethnic neighborhood in Brooklyn, but now she's very much engaged in kind of progressive point of view. And they had just passed the legislation in the city council to allow drug administration sites. And she was against them. And the term she used, maybe you're aware of this term, is shooting galleries. Because when she's like in her 50s or 60s, the Lower East Side used to have buildings that were known for people going in and injecting drugs. Now, the concept in a drug administration site is, well, we're going to control that environment so it's safer for both the people in that environment and people outside. because as you point out, they had shooting galleries before it was legal. But people, regular human beings, are apprehensive about the disorder and the lack of life organizing that goes on for people in those environments. They find it unappealing, even in the most progressive places, like Brooklyn and New York, and even and certainly even in San Francisco. So I want to switch to what you bring to the question. You're a person who deals with kids in an environment where some of them are misbehaving and some of them are not attached to the environment. And they're doing things sometimes, including drugs. And your job is to attach them to the environment. So I would answer her question by saying that you feel there has to be an add-on, that a drug administration site, whatever, you're for safe sites. And by the way, on a personal note, the governor of Vermont just vetoed drug consumption sites in Vermont.
I noticed.
And so there's a kind of your questioner wrote, are you in favor of all this? Is this taking harm reduction too far? Are we excusing people? In a way, we're reinforcing the addiction model by saying we don't expect anything from you. And I think we're inclined to agree with her that the object of making drug use easier or less harmful is a necessary human concern, but that if that's as far as we go, we're not going to succeed in emerging from our addiction, our deaths of despair, and a discontent of tons of high school kids. Is
that sounds about right to me. Now, this is a person, maybe just because I know her, so that I feel like this came across in the email, but she has she's conservative and has just a tinge of ew, drug users left in her, even though she's trying to think objectively about it. Her points are well taken.
and
but
she's not against drug use. She's
not against drug use. I mean, it's not drug use, whatever. She doesn't even want to know if someone's using drugs, really doesn't care. It just are you a productive person? Great. I don't need to know anything about your drug use unless you feel like telling me. She's thinking of this as a quid pro quo. Not the way I think about it. She's thinking of it well, the community's doing this for you, making drugs safe. Shouldn't you have to do something for the community? And maybe that's the case. I don't think of it in moralistic terms like that. I think more about, people should be allowed to be safe, and if you can do something to make things safer in a reasonable way, you should do that.
Answer.
Yeah, I'll read that in a second, but I'm good with making sure that people are safe and doing something for the community. I don't see that as because you owe the community now because they've just done something for you. I see it more like that could be a hub whereby you find a place in the community. I mean, if you really wanted to make a drastic change, even if you're looking long term, then you could see a safe injection facility or a drug consumption site as something like that. Any effort to keep people safer, if you're a harm reductionist and serious about the long term, could be just an inroad to community rather than a treatment center, or as I think she's inferring, you get this thing, we'll give this thing to you, which is like an opportunity to continue living if you continue this behavior, and you owe us. I don't like that, but I understand where she's coming from. So I could read my response, but I'm sure you have more to say.
Your response is kind of harm reduction plus harm reduction as a wedge into further change.
Yeah.
Harm reduction is good, but it's not an end in itself.
I said, I'll skip the niceties. I told her I taught a high school civics class once, and we came up with 3 rules to happiness. We actually did this collaboratively. And I told her, and I'll tell our listeners, forgive the French. Number 1 is do shit. Number 2 is do shit with people. Number 3 is do shit with people for other people. So in other words, when we're talking about people who are addicted, but just really anybody, and I'll read from my response now. It's all about having a community to contextualize themselves in, not just to be taken care of, but to be an active member, which means giving value as well as accepting it. So yes, I agree with your take. Harm reduction, good. I'm for easier access to drugs of choice, and I'm all for drug consumption sites and all of that. But these are stopgaps. And I told her, I like what you said, and you could frame it a few different ways that would be more and less palatable depending on the disposition of your audience. You could say, well, people owe society something if they're going to be given handouts. It's a two-way street. Or you could say people deserve more than just harm reduction services and leniency. They deserve a framework to grow into so that conscious living and community involvement is preferred over intoxication and total oblivion. And then I said, I can imagine a pyramid like the one that Maslow was credited with drawing but never drew, where the bottom rung is harm reduction, like avoiding death in the here and now, staying alive. Then you could get up to like work and home, and then relationships and connections, then community and purpose, then maybe greater goals and legacy if you're worked up to that point. And at some point in that continuum, drug use just becomes a non-issue, not interesting, because drug use to a mature and self-actualized adult is something like what Carl Hart wrote about, and what this person who wrote to me is saying that she doesn't care about. If somebody, a self-actualized mature person, is using drugs, I don't care about that. She's worried about the damage that they're doing to themselves and possibly the people around them.
You believe that people want to have a positive. I believe it's true. We believe that people want to have a positive life. They want to be admired. They want other people. They want to have friends. There's an experiment. You're not allowed to do experiments like this anymore. I've described it before at Baltimore City Hospital, at Johns Hopkins, where they took guys who drank on the street uncontrollably, and they put them in a room and they said, you can drink as much as you want here, or you can come out to the game room where there's a TV and where there are other guys, but you can't drink there. And they always drank less, because even human beings at the tethers of civilization who've given up so much still want to be a part of a group. They still want to participate in positive ways with people. That's a drive that people have. And you want to leverage off of that to offer them an expanded version. You want to offer them harm reduction plus. You want to offer drug consumption sites with a positive outlet, not simply as a place to prevent people from dying.
Totally. That's a really well put. You know, I'm so compatible with the idea of harm reduction. Not only am I compatible, I will vote for harm reduction measures. I always do. I'll push for them. Harm reduction just seems obvious to me. And I don't think that the way, just politically or just socially, the way to keep harm reduction in business, first of all, is to say, well, just let us do this. It's nice. You know, people won't die, because there could be an argument that, well, people are still dying, and B, there could be an argument that, you don't just get to do this. People don't get free handouts. But if you have an idea about what harm reduction is, that's something more like harm reduction plus, or somebody who's more creative than us should come up with a name for this, then what you have is, well, let's keep people alive. And by the way, living people, the majority of them, we can bet on them as wanting to be productive citizens if they can, just the same way you might bet that a casino doesn't want to lose its money or something. It's pretty obvious. And so if you have harm reduction, keeping people alive, and then way into the community, and you don't have to do anything crazy. You don't have to have expensive professionals or something like that. You just have to have a community that they can be I almost said that can absorb them, but I don't want to put the onus on one person or another. A community that they can contextualize themselves in. And
so would you agree that's a description of your work at schools? You're able to take people who are having a negative engagement with the school institution, and you go in. If you have a blind assumption, your blind assumption is, well, they have more to offer and they want to offer more. You just assume that there's an upside that somebody's not tapping, and you want to tap that.
You made a joke once that I was employable because for some reason I can get in touch with this population that other people can't. And there's results back me up because it seems like what I do is help people feel like they're understood. And once they are, then they can rely on me as a resource. And once they do, I can let them know that I don't need to be your only resource. The way that you just connected with me was kind of all you. So you can do this with other people. And that's the reason why I didn't ever want to be a school clinician or counselor per se, is because I noticed when I was working with them that they might have this skill of really getting in touch with people, listening and making them feel heard. And then it's like, well, anyway, sorry you're having such a rough time. See you next Tuesday. And then nothing came of it. I think it's always more saleable. It's always more constructive to both really be a listener to a person, be able to understand and appreciate that humans have different worldviews, and to help them link up with the kind of resources that are already at their disposal, but they might not have the fortitude or ability to see that they're there.
I should back this up. We're both representatives of the Life Process Program, which I developed and which you're a main progenitor of and a coach in. And our goal is to hook people up. It's based on the assumption that they'll feel better about themselves, be less likely to be engaged in negative or addictive behaviors to the extent that they're able to pursue positive things that they value, that other people value, and that will be appreciated by other people and that they're capable of doing. There's a whole mix of things in there about inspiring confidence, having actual skills, what your values are, kinds of interactions you have with people. But we're trying to translate our model of addiction into grassroots, on the ground functioning by people. And you've had discussions with people in Vermont about drug consumption sites. Have you been able to formulate or present a drug consumption site plus model to people? And how do they, some somewhat influential people in that regard. How is that going?
We have in Vermont a model that exists that really pulls on people's agency and willingness and wanting to do better and be community oriented. It's within this umbrella organization called the Howard Center, and it's called Safe Recovery, which there's no real recovery about it. It's always been this back alley seeming, but always invaluable service where people can access anything: work, training, jobs, medical treatment that's funded by the state, or helping people get on an insurance plan, education, social networks. It's this place people go if they want to link up with any of those things. They're just real life things that people have issues with. And then in that space, they put a syringe exchange in. And when the syringe exchange went in that space, now they had all these community resources. Plus, all of the things that you'd want to go away by putting a syringe exchange in went away. This is back also when HIV was worrisome in our area still.
Wait, you're saying they did away with the outreach things?
No. I'm saying in addition to all of this stuff, they put a syringe exchange program in, and it did well.
The syringe exchange was an add-on to a service providing
right
operation.
And in the meantime, or meanwhile, MAT has become this dominant model of what it means for people who are addicted to opiates or whatever to get off opiates. At the same time as this sort of network is operating, which seems very fortunate and doing well in our place, politically speaking, and I guess now socially speaking, the model of recovery, what people think of as recovery, has been MOUD or MAT. So there are clinics that are running, and the idea is, screw all this community stuff. We have MAT, or we have MAT, we can do the community stuff later. And so the very people who were using, those services and, still do sometimes, we think that we have them, if we could just switch them over to this MAT perspective of anyway, the idea.
This backs up, we've been discussing in one context or another how our model of addiction as driven purely by drugs is actually a negative that's causing us to do worse in dealing with things. And you're giving an example. By the way, there's a Democratic congressman from Massachusetts, whose name I don't remember, who got up and started a progressive that we would expect to be on our team, who was against drug consumption sites because they're riddled with this kind of misbehavior. It's a continuing theme that we're throwing away the good to try to do something under the name of something good.
Yeah, that's about it. What I'm getting at in a long-winded way, I guess, is just that we kind of have an organic model of helping our community in place. And the idea of a drug consumption site was that let's take this same physical location and same organization and same model, and then add to it a space where people who are there around there anyway could go and use drugs but not die. They could access all the same things. Perhaps they would even go to this place when they wouldn't have gone before and realize there's sort of a no pressure but resourceful place that they could go and meet people. And so we're kind of doing the opposite of what a lot of places are doing, which is
and you're finding that idea is a hard sell. People have a hard
I'm
time.
saying I'm amazed at what a hard sell it is, especially given when Sarah George, our state's attorney, I helped her a little bit with this push and the wording and how we were going to go about these things. Well, she surveyed the public and the people around that area. Whereas, there's a lot of these progressive pushes and people say, we want these things to happen, but just can you do it somewhere else? Well, people around the Burlington area where this would be overwhelmingly were in support. Citizens are in support here of a drug consumption site. And our politicians are saying no. And our politicians at the same time, with the other hand, are saying, we do have MAT. We should do more of that. We have a solution. So it's a tough sell for who knows why.
Well, so our themes in terms of dealing with, we started out this session by talking about a woman, writing about harm reduction. People should be sort of forced to pay back. And you're saying people want to pay back. People understand that being a part of things and having positive feedback's a plus. That because that's sort of your day-to-day job and your life's work. And we perceive it really, and you've seen it work in the drug area at the Howard Center. And yet somehow we're having a hard time connecting up the concept of harm reduction to that obvious and workable and existent model, because we see harm reduction really purely in terms of, well, there's an addictive drug that could kill you. Let's do away with it killing you, or let's just address the addictive drug. Harm reduction in its worst aspects is as reductive as the Norvolco brain disease model of addiction.
That perfectly put. So at the same time as we were saying, drug focus is completely damaging. The focus on, drugs are causing the problem. On the opposite side of that persuasion is harm reduction, which we're in favor of, except we can't think about harm reduction in this stagnant sort of way. Sort of like when you said, giving out, we applaud, this is how much Narcan we've given out this year. Yay. Wait a minute, more people are dying than ever before. So there you go. That's it in a nutshell.
It's almost as though we're going to make, what do they call it? Somebody who's so backwards. If we didn't have one new thought about addiction in the 20th century, if we just thought in terms of old-time human values, like maybe your grandmother used to think about, those people would be less likely to do bad things if they were more productively involved, which is something that's still a part of educational thinking.
Mhm.
If we had no development of addiction theory, we'd be better off than where we are at this point in time.
I agree. I think if you want to know what you could do about our addiction problem, go ask your next door neighbor who knows nothing about addiction. And completely. But
Well,
okay.
are you optimistic about Vermont and your ability to be a positive force in this network, or are you feeling your agency oats, or you have enough to do in your spare time already?
I certainly have plenty to do, and I think that the things I'm doing are constructive, and who knows. But I'm still trying to figure out where that slice of space is that I can exist in the pushing forward with truly helping people in the addiction realm or citizens in my state.
Attorney, was she responsive to your thinking? Were you having a positive? Did she get you?
Very much. And the only problem with her getting me is that she's already on the same page. You'd be actually surprised. There are people who say, wow, this one good idea, this probably puts her on the map where we are. She really is she's thinking truly progressively, not in a political sense, but she looks around and thinks about where the wind is blowing and how she can truly help people, what does and doesn't work, like a functioning human should. And that sets her apart from, all the politicians.
I don't want to jinx her, but
connection.
she'll get elected governor. I don't know.
Who knows? Hopefully. But all right. Well, it's been a fun talk, and thank you for helping me.
We're going to the second level of harm reduction and addiction theorizing. We're saying, well, how do we really operationalize it in a positive impact way? And this is a second order conversation about harm reduction.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Stanton.
Pleasure's mine entirely, Zach. Au revoir.